I'm Jim Weiss, Chairman and founder of Real Chemistry, and this is the Get Real with the Chairman podcast. So today I'm sharing an inspiring conversation with Pastor Michael McBride, a leader at the intersection of faith, social justice, and public health. As executive director of Live Free USA, he's at the forefront of initiatives that address the criminalization of people of color, gun violence, and criminal justice reform, all really to make communities safer for all of us. Pastor Mike is the lead pastor at the Way Church in Berkeley and a co-founder of the Black Church PAC and Black and Brown Peace Consortium. He's a prominent voice in promoting equity and reducing violence. He has changed really the face of crime, reducing the number of deaths from gun violence incredibly impactfully. So I think the work he does saves lives and improves lives in ways, that I find kind of unusual. This conversation really moved me deeply, and I think it will resonate with all of you as well. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Every interaction helps extend our reach. Really enjoy this episode from wherever you're listening. How are you doing?
Yeah, just trying to kind of navigate this return to an era I thought we wouldn't have to deal with so quickly again.
I mean, you're so accessible as a person. I wonder if you can begin to help some of these people see things differently.
Well, I do believe that it is an important moment to reflect on not just the history of the country, but like the future of the country, and be honest about perhaps we're not as exceptional as we may think we are when it comes to certain forces. I don't want to assume that all of your listeners or even yourself may find the kind of political drift towards what appears to be a kind of demolition of norms of governance, a constitutional kind of sensibilities. Feels like to many of us, particularly, Black folks struggling for some semblance of fairness and equality and civil rights. But it is frightening. I had an elder tell me that he's 72 and he feels terrible that he believes, or he at least feels like we are going to have to fight giants that they thought that they slayed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s when it comes to just like inclusion. We just got to wait and see, but it does feel terrifying for a lot of us, quite frankly.
Given what you've always done, does that in some ways motivate you?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that the struggle for peace and justice and equality is never accomplished in one person's lifetime, right? And so to the extent that we continue to do the work that many of us perhaps feel called to do, are compelled to do, no, it doesn't stop. But it's kind of like, will the conditions for us to do the work be more harsh? Right. And I think that perhaps is the calculation. It's kind of like my beloved 49ers. And it's obvious that Brock Purdy cannot throw the football in the rain. But when it's not raining, he could throw for 300 something yards in an almost perfect quarterback rating. And so that's what that's the best analogy that comes to me today is like.
Well, he had trouble in the snow in Buffalo too, didn't
right. He? So snow and the rain, right? Versus sunny skies, maybe with a little wind here and there. I think that for many of us, it is about the conditions where we have to do this work that will make it either more difficult or less difficult, but it will be difficult nevertheless. And so I think folks are going to have to stay the course, and I hope that others rise to the occasion, because it is going to take all of us to try and, continue to move forward and not take steps back.
So you have been on a path. You're a fourth generation Pentecostal pastor. I don't have conversations with those people all the time.
Not all the time.
You grew up in the church, and it hasn't always been easy. You haven't always been working in the best of conditions, yet you've overcome a lot. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how'd you get here?
I'm a native of San Francisco. My family, my father was a GI Bill Vietnam veteran My mom was a teacher. I graduated from Lowell High School and Mills College. My father's side of his family from North Carolina, Goldsboro to be exact. And so after the Vietnam War, he joined my grandmother, who had since relocated to the Oakland, East Oakland to be exact, and was a head nurse at Kaiser Hospital for almost 25, 30 years. So we've had a life that has been characterized deeply by faith. I'd say we're in the family business of fourth generation holiness Pentecostal, which just means we do speak in tongues, roll on the floor, swing from the chandeliers, and on a good Sunday, we levitate, right? We have great, high-spirited encounters with the Almighty, with God, and it fuels and sustains us. It also gives us, I believe, ability to see beyond the current circumstance. It gives us like a sense of vision, almost like an extra kind of set of 3D glasses to see things that perhaps may not always be obvious. But it doesn't keep us from being impacted by the social ills. And so as a youth pastor, I was physically and sexually assaulted by police officers while I was serving at a church in San Jose. So you can kind of go your whole life, in like a super conservative, Bible thumping church in the Bay Area and still find yourself like getting beat up by the cops for no particular reason. And none of those police officers being held accountable, even though there was some admission that their encounter with me was obviously brutal and unnecessary. And so what I have found throughout the course of my life is that you can kind of do everything that you know to do right and still have to deal with trauma that you did not ask for, that you did not expect. And I think that is the fuel for why I try to do this work. It informs my experience, my trauma, my pain, the healing journey I had to go on. It reminds me that without such healing, without such structure and support, I could have had these traumatic experiences turn me into a monster, right? It could have turned me into someone who had lots of anger, fear, and pain that was not interrogated, that was not fully engaged and turned into almost a superpower. And I find that many individuals, particularly in low wealth communities and Black, brown communities, particularly young men, are experiencing trauma at levels that blow our minds. And yet there is no infrastructure in our cities, states, or the country for young men to have their trauma effectively dealt with. And so I try to be a living example of that, but also acknowledge that my faith journey, my family, the systems, institutions, and structures that have held and produced me, it gives me a bit of a superpower, a leg up, a lot of, dare I say, privilege and opportunity to not be defined by the worst thing that happened to me.
Well, obviously you've channeled that in an incredible way. You're involved with a bunch of foundations, right? In addition to being the lead pastor of the Way Church in Berkeley. I want to hear a little bit more about how you do this work through each of these, and I'm going to list them. So you're the executive director of Live Free USA, where we first met.
Yeah.
The Square One Project, the Way Church, obviously, the Black Church PAC, and the Black and Brown Peace Consortium. Why are you involved in so many of these things? And what are you up to? What does a day in the life of Pastor Mike look like? And what are you trying to accomplish?
Well, Jim, I feel like my ultimate goal is to introduce folks to a faith, dare I say, a God, a higher power, a transcendent being that has not abandoned us, right? That has not left us to our own devices, that has given us a sense of calling, being, and purpose that at the end of the day is about our collective well-being. So the church, particularly in the Black community, has been arguably the most important and influential institution we have. Black churches in the Black community was one of the few institutions that we were able to build, even though often they were still attached to kind of the historical legacy of the kind of slave master and the plantation. Over time, the building of the Black church on Sundays was not its only function. Monday through Fridays, the Black church was our school. On Saturdays, it was our juke joint. It was our club. So, I mean, this was the center of Black life. And so for a lot of us in our communities, this is the historical kind of meeting place and space where we build power, where we make meaning, where we serve as a hub for our communities. I feel called to serve the Way Church since 2005. It's going to my 20th year of pastorage because it was there where I found not just a robust faith, but it also is a space where I was able to make meaningful connections with families and communities and young people, former incarcerated individuals, elected officials, philanthropy leaders, folks like yourself and others. It just became a foundation for not just communal healing and solidarity, but also for us to build power to kind of change the conditions of our community. And so I'm a spiritual leader there. I get to interact with hundreds of folks on a week-to-week basis who are real everyday people living in the Bay Area, predominantly Black folks, but we have a wonderful mixture of non-Black folks that range from immigrants, undocumented folks, Latino folks, Asian folks, white folks. It's a super dope, diverse class space. It's just amazing institutional spot. And we hang out there to try to make meaning and help each other get through the week-to-week, day-to-day hardships.
So you've spoken about men, exploring the other side of their constitutions, their vulnerabilities. How is this openness impacting their health and longevity? I mean, do you feel this is one of the beneficiaries of all the work you're doing? And, tell me more about that notion and concept. You started before in your own experience, but how have you paid that forward?
Yeah, I have found that the lessons and the gifts and the spiritual tools, the resilience, the hope, the joy, the love, the peace, all these virtues that are often kind of channeled through the space and place of our faith institution has built enough power in me that I hope we can figure out ways to build that for other folks. And so whether it's a church or a community-based organization or institutional kind of container, what I find is that this is arguably one of the first generations for many, many men, particularly Black men, where they're not connected to an institution, where they are literally like wandering, looking for meaning and places to belong. And so I've tried to curate and create spaces where not only can they belong, find meaning, find home, find purpose, but they can also find healing. They can find community. They can find direction and do it at a pace where their life is not as at risk, right? And so these institutional spaces, from the church to Live Free to these other kind of iterations that emerge from there, where there are small groups we host, whether they're community walks that we do, whether they're bringing individuals caught as violent encounters, whether folks coming home from jail or prison, curating space where folks can belong to institutions is a very important part of the role I and we play as we build these institutions. They have to be intentionally curated. Unfortunately, most of the institutions that have young men of color in mind are the penal institutions. It's the jails, it's the prisons, and they're structured to receive these individuals. And we want to create spaces where these folks can find that community without having to be in touch with a law enforcement officer or a carceral system. And I know some folks say, well, just don't break the law. Well, I would agree, right? Like, I think no one should break the law, right? But I find a lot of people who break the law and they don't get in touch with the carceral systems. So the question for us is like, should folks have to live an exemplary life without any mistakes in order to have access to healing and opportunity and second chances? I would say no, right? I would say that the mistakes I've made in my life, even though I tried to do everything right, there was something that caught me that allowed me to not have to hit rock bottom. And that is the work that we're trying to do. We want to intentionally curate and create these spaces. And this country and many folks want to do that on the cheap. I want to say, no, let's put some steroids in that equation. Let's scale it up and make it muscular So we can help save and heal and redeem a lot of men's lives.
Right. And then they become really awesome members of their communities,
100%.
continuing that whole thing. And you're having success with that. You've had success. We met related to gun safety and violence, community violence through Coach Kerr. How are community violence intervention programs like the ones you're involved in places like the Bay Area, Chicago, and New York City, how's that transforming even public health and healthcare, people living maybe more purposeful, healthier lives, better lives?
I mean, it's having arguably a generational impact. What we found in most cities across the country, that less than half of 1% of the city's population is responsible for as much as 50 to 60% of the gun-related shootings or homicides, which just means that there's a super small number of individuals who are caught in cyclical, repeatable violence. And with very specific interventions on this significantly small number of individuals in your city, we could, without mass incarcerating everyone or engaging in mass disproportionate or unconstitutional policing, we could literally reduce the costs of public safety. We could increase investments in public health and target individuals who are at the highest risk of shooting or being shot. And in these cities like Oakland, we saw 50% reduction over about 5 years from 2014, 15, all the way up to 2019. Then the COVID generational crisis and pandemic caused violence to shoot up all across the country because much of our programs went offline while people were obviously sheltering in place. A lot of our folks weren't considered first responders, so we just could not do the intervention. But now in the last 2 years, we've started to do the intervention, and now we're starting to see the violence go back to pre-pandemic levels just in 2 years. And it's even going deeper in a lot of other places thanks to the investment that we've been able to advocate at the federal and state and local level to these CVI interventions. So Oakland has seen a huge reduction. Oklahoma City, where we work, almost a 70% reduction in the neighborhood where they've been working. Detroit, Michigan, historic reductions, I think 40-something%. We're in Orlando, Florida, has gone almost 6 months without one gun-related homicide in their city. And so we're in well over 10 cities currently, just live free, engaging in the work of peacemaking, and are finding that when men are engaged with healing, with opportunity, and with some structure, they opt out of violence without having to go to jail or even at times take a job. Now, we want them to obviously have opportunity because it is important. But what we have realized is that these young men and their families want to live. They're not on some kind of death wish. Very often are just overwhelmed with anger, fear, and pain, often trying to protect themselves from what they view to be real or imagined or assumed violence. And so our intervention helps to make sure that we can keep people, as we say, living free from violence and incarceration. And that is the work that we do. And it works all across the country. Our hope now is just to keep scaling it up.
What role does faith play in religion and all of that?
I mean, some people have deep religion and deep faith, and some people don't, right? I feel like the role, as I see it, for faith and religion is meaning making, right? It's helping people to understand that there is a purpose, there is a calling, if you will, there's a vocation, there's something greater than themselves that they ought to be in the service of. So for folks who come from, say, a faith tradition where they're Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, you can appeal to ideas, concepts, philosophies that are age old that can unlock the God gene that, is measured inside folks across the world. And then some folks are agnostic and atheists. They've seen too much, or they've come to their own reasoning that they don't believe in God. And yet there is something greater than them: love, peace, joy, justice, some idea that we hope to unlock within them to cultivate hope. And so it is about meaning making. It's about them being able to see beyond their circumstance. Faith is the ability to see beyond that which you are limited through your own senses, to believe something is better, something is greater. And we inject that through our actions first. And when welcomed our speech later. If that makes sense, right?
And you're not saying everyone has to go to church per se, right?
Oh, no.
That's not
No.
the healer, but you're the pastor. So walk me through. You hit a city. What do you do? Like, how does it set up? How do you recruit? How do you get people involved?
Yeah, I'll use Oakland and Berkeley as an example, since that's kind of where, a lot of our work happens. So on any given day in the city of Oakland or the city of Berkeley, some of the surrounding areas, Richmond, we have individuals who wake up every day and their singular task is to focus on the 20 to 30 young men and their families who are on their caseload. We use a public health model because we appreciate that if you've been shot by a gun or shot with a gun, if you've been shot at, then you likely have been traumatized. Like, no one's getting shot at, no one's getting shot. And it's like, that doesn't impact me, right? So public health has to be our first kind of approach. Every day in our communities, we are attempting to prescribe a public health response to what is often considered a police response solely, or a carceral response solely. We want to say, if you have experienced gun violence, if you've been shot, or if you've been shot at, or your family member has passed because of gun violence, then you are a walking ball of trauma. Most people in our communities don't get access to public health response. So, for instance, I was in Buffalo, New York, a couple days after the shooting at that hospital, terrible shooting. And David Hogg, who was one of the survivors of the Parkland shooting in Florida, happened to be there with us. And it was so interesting just to see and hear the way he talked about how the response in Parkland was so much different than the response in Buffalo. He said that there were dozens of trucks and hundreds of counselors that were extended to the students in Parkland. And in Buffalo, it was perhaps less than one or two therapists who were extended just to the family. And one of the therapists was afraid to be in the room by themselves. They asked a police officer to come stand in the room to be with them while they provided therapeutic services to the family. The schools did not get any therapists for the children who witnessed this massacre on a Saturday morning. And so just this idea that people can experience that level of trauma and not get any public health support. Then, of course, their own body, their mind, their spirit is going to process it in their own way. In cities across the country, we hire either formerly incarcerated, or we call them directly impacted community members, people who have been shot themselves and been rehabilitated, people who have done the shooting and been rehabilitated, people who have been shot and survived, and their families. And we train them on public health interventions, on how to help people who are having a mental health crisis. And that, when done well, it reduces violence by 30, 40, 50% within 18 months.
You were talking about this concept or faith as a transcendent interlocutor, elevating us from mundane realities and connecting us to broader narrative. How does this process of creating meaning through faith aid in this public health initiative?
So I do believe that when we come to meaning making, when we come to purpose, sometimes one can be so anchored, or dare I say, being pulled down by the vicissitudes, the difficulties, the hardships of life, that just the ability to look up, the ability to have a vision that transcends your particular circumstance is all some people need in order to kind of wrestle their way out of hopelessness and despair. I often tell the young people I work with that hopelessness is as deadly as a bullet. And so if faith, if meaning, if purpose can be the kind of center of a wheel with spokes shooting out of it in all different directions, that serves as the structure by which you resist the urge to give up or to perhaps be a part of the problem, not the solution. If hope is all you need, then my job is to grab your hopelessness, right? And use faith, use music, use art, use culture, use relationships, use resources to figure out a way to jumpstart the hope that I believe is within them. See, most people think faith is this set of dogmatic ideas. And I want to say that faith is action. It is a commitment to that part of us that we can't fully see, but we know is there.
How do you do that? How do you bring the God and divinity or some of that into your work?
I'm very much formed by the depth and breadth of the Christian tradition. I say I'm a holiness Pentecostal. The dumb thing about the Christian tradition is it's thousands of years old. And so there are things that are implicit and there are things that are explicit. So, for example, in our tradition, we have this kind of monk or mystic called Brother Lawrence, and he talks about practicing the presence of God by breathing, by looking at nature, by acknowledging that that which you see is an extension or an expression of the divine. Implicitly, right, that then means that every action that I do is an act of faith. And by my faithfulness to that practice, I'm introducing faith implicitly, not explicitly, but people will ask you, can you pray with me? Of course I can pray with you, right? Can you sit with me? Can I confess some things to you? Can we read sacred texts together, whether it's scripture or the Quran or wisdom writings from different religious traditions? And all of that together, I think, is an expression of how faith shows up. Implicitly, it can show up as one of my favorite theologians, Francis of Assisi, who Pope Francis currently was named after. He has this saying, it says, preach the gospel at all times, preach the good news at all times, and sometimes speak, right? Which just is to say, like, implicitly through our actions, we can proclaim good news. And then explicitly through practices, spiritual practices, we can give concrete expression of that which we've been proclaiming. And so we have young men and women and families all the time, whether they are part of a religious tradition or not, they welcome through our, as I say, ministry of presence, their comfortability with us. They welcome us to pray with them, to invite them to some of our religious spaces or services, to share food together, break bread together, read spiritual texts together, sing songs together. Sometimes we engage in acts of healthy eating together, on and on. All these in our tradition are spiritual practices, and they unlock spiritual power.
We started this off with how you're feeling in the midst of all the things that are happening relative to injustice. Can faith be a bridge to rectify injustice? I feel like in talking about all this, to battle that, having faith and working the way you do, can that be the bridge?
Yes, I certainly believe faith has a huge role to play in the bridging of divides in our society. For good or for bad, faith has such a civic role in our society. It has for many years served a kind of meaning-making kind of framework for our society. I often say that the worst of our faith's traditions ought not be seen as the representation of faith in our society, right? I think that the opposite of bad faith is not no faith. The opposite of bad faith, I would say, is good faith, right? And so the question for us is, it can bridge so many differences and challenges as long as it's the expression of good faith. As I say, of faithful faith, the ability to allow our practices, our beliefs to appeal to our higher selves, to speak truth in love, to embrace the disenfranchised, to share with the hungry, the clothed and naked. All those callings are things that have to often be called out of us because we are shaped in this country to be radically individual people who, in times of tragedy, we can have a temporary response of charity, but not fully appreciate that it is the day-to-day decisions we make that make tragedies less likely and make abundance more accessible. And so I do believe that faith has a huge role, but I acknowledge that it has to be good faith. It has to be faithful faith. I am an adversary for a kind of faith. I'm an opponent for the kind of faith that would be used to oppress individuals and harm individuals and steal from individuals and promote scarcity and hatred and malice. People do use faith to do that, just like people use their money to do that, right? We don't throw away the money. We just say, well, let's be more responsible with our money. And that's what I would say about faith. For me, for us, this is a act of faith. It is a collection of actions, activities of faith, because we believe our community members who are caught in violent cycles need someone to see them beyond the violence. And you need faith to do that, or else anger, fear, and pain may win the day. And so I pray that expression of faith happens not just here in our region, but across the country, and dare I say, across the world. People of faith ought not need to use bombs and weapons to live in harmony. People of faith ought to use peace, love, and abundance. And that's what I want our faith, my faith, the faith to be used for.
The labels don't matter, right? So it's non-denominational, right? It's pretty universal how you harness to drive this faith for positive outcome.
I would think so. I just offer, humbly that sometimes we have a predilection to move too quickly to the ambiguous and the amorphous rather than the concrete. I think it's valuable to start somewhere, to put your feet firmly somewhere and be accountable to those practices, because the accountability to the practices that are specific are what turn you into another creature, if you will, a perhaps improved person. And so right now, I'm trying to get my bearings and be more healthy. And I'm trying to do it without a trainer. And it's hard because when I hit my point of resistance, my body will just be like, okay, I know you're supposed to do 20, but let's just do 15. Let's just do 15 because, your muscles, they tired, you've done enough. But that trainer will be standing over you saying, hey, keep pushing, because on the other side of 20, there's a breakthrough. And I think that the faith traditions that can be concrete for us can give us at least the anchor that does not cause us to be overwhelmed by idolatry, whereby we just make faith into something that reflects us. I want to suggest that faith at its best is love, it's joy, it's peace, it's hope. Whatever religious tradition gets you closer to those, I say jump in with both feet, but take it seriously, because it is the discipline of faith that gives you, I believe, the transformation that is necessary for both yourself and those around you. We often say the first revolution is an internal one. So attend to that internal revolution, and may it lead to many expressions of transformation all around us.
So let's talk about the future.
I think we need leadership in 2025 that takes seriously the threats that are before us, so we can take seriously the solutions needed. I'm hoping I can leave naivete behind and get much more clear about what is required of me as a leader in this unique moment in history. And I think our country has to get serious about the internal threats to this democracy that are easily exacerbated by external threats to this democracy. And we need political leaders, we need faith leaders, we need government and business leaders, we need citizens who are serious about this stuff, so we can leave a better world to our children. And right now, I'm worried, and so I don't want to be a fool. I want to be someone who's too serious about making sure that this thing is better, because all this is happening on my watch. I turn 50 next year, and I realized that, for the last decade, like I'm supposed to be a leader, and this is all happening on my watch. I feel terrible about that. I feel some responsibility about that, so, I don't want to just take that very lightly.
Well, you're going to do a lot of the same things, just with more focus, more perseverance. That I can buy. So let me, we've talked a lot in my firm about AI, right? The issues of AI. Do you envision AI impacting access to religion or your profession? If AI could develop a meaningful sermon, what would that mean to you?
I mean, I have colleagues and friends who use AI for sermon writing and research. I want to believe that my sermon prep would be better than AI, that I bring a unique kind of spirit and intuitiveness that cannot be replicated by artificial intelligence. But I definitely think that AI is already impacted. I mean, AI technically are the algorithms in our social media feeds. It is, Chat GPT is helping folks write books and all kind of things. So it's had an implicit, maybe even an explicit impact. The question is not what will it have an impact or if it will have an impact. My question is, what will AI do to our souls, to our spirit, the parts of us that are not seen? And I think one of the challenges we have is we are increasingly becoming a technocratic society. And Dr. King warned against this. And I think we must not reduce ourselves to our output. I think we have to remind ourselves that we are uniquely situated among all created things with something that cannot be boiled down to an output. We talked about faith earlier. We talked about human resilience earlier. We talked about, the ability to connect emotionally with folks. I think that we have to remind ourselves consistently, these things like AI have to be seen as tools, but not replaceable of that which is ineffable, that which cannot be created with our human hands. So I hope that it's a tool and not a cheap replacement for sure, for religion, faith, for all.
Well, that's all right. I think a lot of people are freaked out about it. I think one of the many things we're freaked out about, but as you said, got to stop freaking out. You got to focus. You got to get shit done, and you got to solve the problem seriously. And that's, I do think that, like you said, it's a tool. It's a tool to help it. I kind of agree with that. Look, I always, end on a little bit of a lighter note. I like to get some personal stuff out. So I like to always ask kind of what's your guilty pleasure?
So my guilty pleasure is going into all the sports games I can go to. 49ers, the Warriors, splurging on seats that I can't afford.
All right. Now we're putting you on a desert island. Now, what album would you keep if you could only keep one?
Earth, Wind, and Fire. I was just playing that. Do you remember September? I was just playing that for my sermon on Sunday. So it's at the top of my head. Earth, Wind, and Fire would definitely be with me on a
They
beach.
are the best. You're right. I love them. They're so good. Yeah. For me, it's always Grateful Dead all the time. But, I definitely hear you on that. I love my Earth, Wind, and Fire. All right. Well, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
And being so real, honest. Keep up the great work you're doing. I mean, that's some faith. I got faith in you.
Love you, brother. Good to be with you.
Same here. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening in today. The Get Real with the Chairman podcast is a production of Real Chemistry. I want to thank my team, led by executive producer Kate Voss, audio engineer Nick Murphy, and composer Matt Lipkins, and special thanks to Danielle Clark-Brown and the amazing team at Real Chemistry. If you like what you heard, don't forget to review our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Also, please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the road.